Well, let me back up a little bit. I am Jean Darby Cline, the author of Silencing the Voices, One Woman's Triumph Over Multiple Personality Disorder. I am not a mental health professional by trade. I've worked for 33 years in computing with data processing, and I don't have the training, the background for it, but I wrote this book on the basis of my experience and in the hope of making something good out of something horrific, that in some way I could help not just the people who are going through this and their families, but perhaps the mental health professional to see what it's really like from the inside out and what it takes to recover, and also to let you know that recovery is possible. Not only possible, but desirable. I'm now happier than I've ever been in my life. I'm married to the most wonderful man alive, back here with the camera, and I have 4 wonderful children. Embarrassing. All right. When I was diagnosed as a multiple, I ran out and I read everything I could find on the subject, and I was absolutely horror-stricken. I thought, my God, this is not my life. All these stories seem so bizarre. These people seem to be so non-functioning. And that wasn't my life. Working for the Boeing company in Seattle at the time, and I was a project manager. I had just put in a multi-million-dollar, multi-site, multiple computing system project, a month ahead of schedule and under budget, something that doesn't happen very often in corporate America. And I was getting an outstanding contribution award. 6 months later, none of those computing systems had failed, and they gave me the Boeing Employee of the Year award. This is at a time when Boeing had about 125,000 employees. So I was very honored. You'll have to forgive the tape on this name. I remarried since I got this award. I don't share that name anymore. Okay. I want to tell you a true story about the USS Enterprise. It's an aircraft carrier that was stationed down in Bremerton, Washington, about, 150 miles from here. And it was moved down to port in California. It became its home port. It was coming into home port late at night. It was very dark. It was very foggy. And the captain was notified that there was a light directly ahead. And immediately had the radio room send a message. And the message said, "We're on a collision course. Change your heading immediately." And the message came back, "You need to change your heading." And he said the message, "Repeat, change your heading immediately." And the message came back, "You need to change your heading." And so he got a little perturbed, and he said, "Send this message. This is the captain of the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier, and I am directing you to change your heading immediately." And the message came back, "This is the lighthouse. Your call." Sometimes we can't just shove aside something in front of us. We have to change our heading, our direction, ourselves, so that we're not running into it. I couldn't change my childhood. It staked in time. But I could change myself so that I wasn't running headlong into the effects of it for the rest of my life. You know, our bodies are always in the process of mending themselves. You know, we cut ourselves, bruise ourselves, burn ourselves, hopefully not break too many bones, but we're always in the process of mending. But our minds are something else. Somewhere along the way, we have to take responsibility and say, if I'm going to be well, I'm going to have to work on it. I'm going to have to take an active role. And that's what I had to do. To understand dissociation, remember that we learn through association. I want to tell you a little story about a couple of friends, Frank and Bill and his wife invited Frank and his wife over to dinner one night. And after dinner, the ladies went into the kitchen to make coffee. And Bill said to Frank, "Didn't you just come back from a memory clinic?" And Frank said, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "What'd you learn?" He said, "Oh, they taught us all the latest techniques for recall, especially association." And he said, "Oh, that's wonderful. What's the name of the clinic?" And Frank said, "Oh, I know. What's that long, that flower with the long stem and the thorns?" And he goes, Bill said, "Oh, you mean a rose?" And he said, "Yeah, that's it. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that clinic?" Associations. We build them all our lives. We build them before we're born. You know, newborn babies are often laid on their mother's stomach and chest because the heartbeat's familiar to them. And we're always looking for the familiar. The familiar comforts us. How many times have you walked into a room and went, "Well, he's got a nose just like my Uncle Joe," or "She walks with a little limp just like my mother used to"? You know, we're always seeking out the familiar. How many times have you been someplace you know you've never been before, but you go, "Boy, this feels familiar"? You know, because we're always seeking out that familiar. So we build these associations. Now we build associations for objects, and we build associations for experiences. They're kind of like tree structures. We kind of tag those pieces that we recognize. Let's say, for instance, even before you have verbal skills, your mom takes you down to the park in a stroller. And the first thing that happens is a cat comes across the road. And you're thinking, oh, what's that? Mom says, it's a cat. Look, it's a cat. And even though you don't have the verbal words, you recognize that it's black, it's alive, it's moving, it's a cat. Right? But 20 paces further down, there's a crow, and it's hopping across the road. It meets all the criteria in the tree that you just built, right? So you're thinking cat. Mom says, no, look, what? And it takes off flying. It's a bird. So you put a new category of association in there. It flies, it's a bird. But of course, 20 pieces down, there's a black butterfly, and it meets all the criteria. And you're far too young to develop the concept of large and small at this point, but they tell you it's a butterfly. Right? And then you go home to supper and Dad blows it all for you and says, pass the butter, it doesn't meet any of the criteria. But we build these trees of associations for our experiences as well. And we may attach all kinds of things to them. All of ours attached to those associations. And so when we recall them, we can recall them with multiple keys. You know, if you think of a database, we can recall them. We might have hidden memories that we recall by smell. Say your grandmother died when you were 3 years old, but she used to be really loving and give you lots of nice words and lots of hugs when you were little. And suppose further that she's baked snickerdoodles, so that every time you walk into the house, anybody's house, and smell cinnamon for the rest of your life, probably, you get a nice, warm, cozy feeling inside, because you associate that with the love that your grandmother gave you and the smell of the cinnamon in her house. Okay, I want to talk about how we get those memories back. And in the process of that, I'm going to pass around a candle, talk about associations. It looks like Jell-O, but please don't eat any. Take it, close your eyes, smell it, and try to capture the picture that comes to mind when you smell this candle. I thought originally when I came out to speak that I'd just get a little pine spray and spray it in the air for you, but they don't make pine spray anymore. Everything's country kitchen, country garden or something. Anyway, so if you do that. Now let's talk about how we get those memories back. Because we built this whole series of associations, we can get all kinds of things that trigger it back. They can be sights, that is locations. They can be sounds. They can be tactile feelings. They can be some movement, somebody's gesture, somebody's facial expression. They can be tastes. But the strongest one is smell. Smell is directly hooked to your midbrain. So it'll bring back memory faster and more vivid than almost any other sense. And so, but I had a friend who was triggered by sound. My friend's name was Peter. And I was working with Peter at a company one time. And we're in the cafeteria, and a glass broke back in the kitchen. And I saw Peter just absolutely gripping the edge of the table. And I said, Peter, what's going on? And he said, well, he was in an accident several years back. Don't worry about it. I said, no, Peter, this is not normal. You need to get some help. He was going through a panic attack from the sound of breaking glass. Now, it was a really horrific accident. And so I thought, well, yeah, you would feel really bad for a long time. But, this was not reasonable. Have you ever been a little fender bender? You're hanging up your cellular phone, got to go bump into somebody. If you do that, you probably remember all of it for the rest of your life with embarrassment. But if you're in a really horrific accident, like my friend Peter, you're driving down the freeway at 65 miles an hour. Suddenly, the car in front of you hits an ice slick, swoops around, and is now facing you on the freeway. You probably remember, with high anxiety, that you looked to your right and you saw a car going by. You couldn't get out that way. You look to your left, there's a big semi going by. You can't get out that way. You look at your speedometer and you know that even though you're slamming on the brake, you're going to be hurt. And unless you're unconscious, you probably remember being painfully extracted from that car and taken for medical care. But the chances of you remembering that moment of impact are slim to none. Now why? Because that's the moment of your highest fear and anxiety. Real or perceived, it is. How many people had a dream of falling? Did you ever dream of falling? Dream of falling? Did you ever hit bottom? No. We don't hit. We wake ourselves up, or we change our dream, or we trip in our dream. You just sleep next to somebody and they go like that, and they've tripped in their dream. Because we can't tolerate hitting bottom. We want to wake ourselves up and do something different. Well, Peter didn't remember that moment either. When we have something like that, we encapsulate that moment in time. We put it into a walled-in area in our mind, and we say, don't look. But you know what? It's all there, all of it. All the triggers that went with it. All the sights, the sounds, the feelings, everything. We just encapsulated and put up the wall. Well, Peter underwent hypnosis. Now, I personally did not use hypnosis in my therapy in recovery. Probably because I was a control freak. I mean, I was so careful about the time. I'd lose time, and I didn't want to lose time, and so I wouldn't let anybody hypnotize me. But I've seen it work very effectively with a number of people, and it did with Peter. Peter was hypnotized, and he was able to step over the wall that he had built. And within that, he was able to re-experience that moment in time. He remembered exactly how the metal came crushing and the steering wheel came in on his chest. He remembered tasting blood. He remembered the sound of things crashing and people screaming. He remembered smelling gas and oil and being afraid the car would burst into flame and he would die in a fire. And it was very fearful. But the thing that really got to Peter was that he had an old foreign car. He didn't realize that not every car had safety glass. And all at once that windshield shattered and shards came shooting in at him. And he threw up his hands to protect his eyes. But he used to drive with his hands at the bottom of the steering wheel. This particular moment in time, he had his hands above the steering wheel. If he had been driving the way he normally drove, his hands would have been trapped by the steering wheel when it came in, and he would have been blinded. And he carried that psychological fear of that blinding with him for all those years. Now, in the course of his therapy, he broke a lot of glasses, but he finally got over the fear of breaking glass. He said he'd probably always be uncomfortable about driving on the freeway when it was icy, but he did get over the fear of the sound of the breaking glass. Now, what about that candle? Anybody want to share? What did it remind you of? Anything? Christmas? Yeah?
First I thought spruce tree.
Spruce tree, yeah.
And then I thought Play-Doh.
Play-Doh, yeah. It did sound a little like Play-Doh, right? Yeah. I've had people tell me it's pine salt. Yeah. Pine salt. You know, pine salt was the next thing I tried after I looked for a spray. But that does, it smells like the clean. In fact, I asked people in previous presentations if they had any bad experiences. And one elderly gentleman told me it smelled like the cleaner they used to clean the hospital room where his wife died. And I said, yeah, that would make you feel really bad. But the other one was a lady who said her mother used to use Renewzits. And she said it's a good air freshener, but her mother used to open it all the way up, set it right next to the toilet. So every time you went in to use the facilities, you were just gagging, you know? So, yeah, it would make you feel bad, too. Okay, well, I'd like to share with you something that was a very powerful trigger for me, and I'll give you a little history as to what it is. Now, what I want to do is throw this out to you. It's not dangerous. And catch it and toss it on to the next person, and then think about what you just had. Okay? Oh, got her coming. I'm sorry. Oh, dear. Well, one more. Here we go. Oh. Okay, this was a very powerful trigger for me. I didn't own a dryer for almost 2 decades because I told myself I liked the smell of fresh linen on the line. I'm sorry. I like the quality time of taking my kids to the basement and hanging up the laundry and telling stories and singing songs, you know. But the truth of it is, you didn't want to follow me into a laundromat because guess what? If the dryers aren't clean before I came, you got 2 layers after I left. And I once had a fellow tell me he didn't have a clue what that was, and I said, hey, you lived at home till you got married, didn't you? He said, how'd you know? I said, well, I had a clue. Anyway, you want to toss one up here, I'll talk about it. Whoa. Okay, let me give you some history of how I came to be a multiple. I was 3.5 years old when my mother had a new baby. I had a brother who was 1.5 years older than I was. So at 5 and 3.5, we were pretty much on our own emotionally. My mother's entire emotional and actually physical attention went into her new baby. And that new baby just took all of that attention. Now, I was lucky. I had more time with my mother than 3.5 years than any of my siblings. But we were pretty much on our own. My father gave us very negative attention, so we didn't want to have anything to do with him. So we were kind of, my siblings and I are really close, and I think we started from a very young age of depending upon each other for a lot of our attention. However, at 3½, my father decided to pull me into bed with him naked, and we'd have playtime together. Now, intuitively, I knew that was wrong, because I couldn't tell my mother, and I better not tell anybody else. And that message was real clear to me. So in order to deal with trying to please my father and get this attention that I wanted from him, I had to become somebody else. I had to be able to look over there and say, they're doing those bad things, Jean and her daddy, not me. Right? So I became Jody. And Jody was looking out for number one. Okay? Jean and her daddy, Jean could be good to everybody, but Jody on me. Okay? At 5½, I became my daddy's favorite. He took me everywhere with him. He was an accomplished pianist, and he used to enter me in little talent contests. And I'd win little cameras and radios and things like that. And he'd play and I'd sing. But he also took me to the basement and did terrible things. Now, the physical and sexual abuse I endured happened in the laundry room of the house that I grew up in. And the dryer was not properly vented. And over time, everything in the room, including the floor, got coated in dryer lint. And so when I was struggling in pain and fear and grabbing hold of anything I could hold on to, I was ending up with was dryer lint. And it became a powerful trigger for me. Couldn't touch it, couldn't stand it. And yet when I had to, if I actually ended up with it in my hand, I would hear screaming in my head. It was just that powerful trigger for me. Well, now, I handled a lot of dryer lint in my therapy, like Peter did glasses, and there's nothing dangerous about it. I wouldn't want to eat it, but it's nothing really dangerous. Okay, I want to tell you an old and corny joke. Bear with me if you've heard it. There was a woman who wanted to be a scientist, so she decided to study frogs. Did the old Palos dog theory, feed the frog a fly and snap your fingers and say jump, and the frog would jump, right? So after a while, she said, I'm going to do some measurements. So she took the frog, set it on the table, said, jump. The frog jumped, 16 inches, good jumper, right? So she took the frog and taped the front legs to the body, put it back on the table, said, jump. Frog didn't move. Jump. The jump kind of lopsided, 7½ inches, not too bad. Great. So she just took the frog, taped the back legs to the body as well, put it on the table, said, jump. Frog didn't move. Jump. Frog didn't move. Aha, she wrote. Conclusion. Tape all 4 legs of the frog to its body, the frog goes deaf. Lack of criteria. Now, I don't know much about the Canadian healthcare system, unfortunately. Back in the U.S., I feel sorry for the mental health professionals because they have to deal with mangled care or managed care. But when you deal with people with dissociative illnesses, mental health professionals have either a lack of criteria or too much criteria. And so it's sorting out what the heck is going on. I feel sorry for my first psychiatrist. Now, he's read Silencing the Voices, and he said, now it makes sense. But the first psychiatrist I saw was over 30 years ago. 30 years ago, MPD, now it's called Dissociative Identity Disorder, which I much prefer. But, that wasn't a diagnosis that was even considered. It was some rare thing they heard of in a book someplace, and nobody ever would consider it. So if I went in and told him I heard screaming or I heard voices in my head, what did he think? Schizophrenia, right? Give her some drugs, balance their brain. Ooh, you know how fast you end up in the hospital and they give you drugs to balance your brain's not out of balance? I was shaking for days. Well, poor guy, he'd see Jean, a very depressed, if not depressing individual, in there trying so hard to please everybody. And then several weeks later, he'd see Jody, very outgoing, carefree, no big deal, right? Bipolar. Of course, back then it was manic depressive, right? Give her some lithium. Lithium's a good drug. I'm sure it's the right one for some. But for me, I called my psychiatrist the first morning I took lithium. And I said, you know what? I'm over here at corporate headquarters of the company I work for. And they have the most marvelous green marble floor you have ever seen. It has properties I've never seen in a floor. It can roll right up and smack you in the face. He said, don't take any more of that drug. Poor guy never did figure out what was wrong. In fact, I was in the mental health system for 12 years before I met Jack Ryder, and he was able to diagnose that I was a multiple. That what was going on in my life was that I had built walls between my experiences, and that I now have to go break those down in order to be well and whole. Well, I want to tell you a little joke about ducks. George and Mary lived on the edge of town on a small farm. And after Easter, everybody dumped off their ducks, right? They all buy these little ducks and give them to kids for Easter, and they're real cute and cuddly when they're small and they get big. And then nobody wants them. So they dumped them off, and George and Mary named them all, and they were taking care of them for a long time. And then finally, Mary said, look, George, you go out and you plow the back 40, or you go down and play pool with your buddies, but I'm here all day with this quack, 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 quack. I can't take it anymore. Get rid of those ducks. And George says, I can't get rid of those ducks. They're just like family to me. And he said, no, I've got to have some peace and quiet. Well, George just loved those ducks. So he went over to his neighbors and he said, Sam, Mary just needs a break. She needs some peace and quiet. Please, I can't do it to the zoo. I'm taking Mary to the movies tomorrow. I want the ducks gone when I get back. Mary needs some peace. So they went to the movies. They came back and all the ducks were gone. Peace reigned. They were overjoyed. They sat and ate their dinner. And by, George goes, I'm sure going to miss those ducks. And all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. They open the door, and here's Sam with all the ducks. And he's going, what's going on? And Sam says, well, I did what you wanted. I took the ducks to the zoo. We had so much fun. I'm taking them to the ballpark next week. Look, communication problem here, right? Communication is really the key to being well and whole. It's breaking down those walls. It's clearing up those misunderstandings. It's resolving the differences between the identities. Now, you know, MPD, multiple personality disorder, was renamed a number of years to Dissociative Identity Disorder. And the reason I really prefer that name, even though it came out with this book, as I say, I think of an identity as those emotions and expectations of reciprocal emotions. Whereas a personality, I think of what I am today, you know, kind of well and whole, my combined memories and mores and hopes and dreams and aspirations and skills. If you had told me a dozen years ago that I'd be standing here in front of a group of strangers telling jokes, I tell you, you're out of your mind. But with the organizational skills of Jean and the outgoing gregarious of Jody and the creative talent of my injured child JD, I can be here today. I can talk to you. I couldn't have done that without becoming well and whole. Well, I've often been asked, why aren't you just angry and outraged over what happened to you? I was. Over and over. We go through cycles of grief. And it's not really that different from what you go through. We experience losses all of our lives. And so we have to deal with these cycles of grief. Now, I've had people say, well, now, why would I ever want to be integrated? You know, well, you make better choices when you have all of you in one place at one time. I married my first husband, a very mentally abusive man, to escape a physically abusive household. If I'd been well and whole, I probably would have made better decisions. I don't know how I got so blessed to have my husband, but I would have hoped that I would have made that decision earlier in my life if I had been well and whole. But, you know, I read recently an article by Dr. Frank Putnam. He just had an article on the web recently. And one of the things he said was that people who are multiple have a resistance to integration, the process of becoming well and whole, because they have an invested, narcissistic investment in their alters. And that's true. You know, when you're a person, you go, I don't want to be gone. But, you know, you don't go away. You see, you splinter off part of the whole. You can't lose a part of the whole. You can only put it back together again. But it's more than that. I think that's kind of simplistic. If you think about it, one of the things that we struggle so hard against is not that we don't want to go away, but I have a system that works. It's got problems, but it works. I'm still working. I'm still raising my kids. If I start changing that system, is it still going to work? Or am I going to become non-functioning? I don't know if I want to find out. I don't know if I want to try this. The other thing is, we have a fear of the unknown that goes beyond that. I put up those walls for a reason. I didn't want to deal with that pain. Why should I want to now? You know, it's kind of that fear of having to relive it, the abreaction, if you will, that we don't want to do. And so, you know, we're pushing it away from us. So we have to do a lot of internal processing to say, I really want to be well and whole enough to step over that wall and to say, what happened to one happened to all. I'm really only one person, so I have to own those experiences if I want to be well and whole. I can't just keep them walled off forever. I need to see what's there. And then there are things that you're going to find out about yourself as a multiple that you wouldn't otherwise know until you start sharing the memory, particularly if you have a child who's been silenced. By the way, Silencing the Voices, that title meant that as a child, the voice was silenced. We don't want to silence the voices. We want to combine them. Well, if you have small children, or I tell my friends, if you have small children, buy your child a very small pet. Not a dog or a cat. A gerbil, a hamster, a hedgehog, a white rat, a guinea pig. Something with a real short lifespan. Because you know what happens? The kid gets attached to it and it dies. And they learn a very important lesson. Every time I read or hear about a teenager who's killed herself or himself over the loss of their first love, I think, here's a child who never learned how to grieve. I think they should teach death and dying in the grade school level. It's too important. We experience loss all of our life. Well, when you're multiple, you go through a lot of these grief cycles. How many people have a dog? You have a dog? Anybody have a dog? You have a pet that's not a dog? Okay, pretend it's a dog. You're going to take your dog for a walk. Go down the street, a couple blocks, and the dog runs out in the street. Car comes around the corner, and bang, the dog's dead. What's the first thing you're going to do? I'm going to say, it didn't happen. Couldn't happen, right? That's my dog. I'm asleep. I'm dreaming. I'm at home, safe in bed, the dog's alive, right? We don't want to believe that tragedy has hit. We do that with a lot of loss in our life. And when you're multiple, you do the same thing. Sexual abuse? Not my family. You know, I knew I didn't live in Beaver Cleaver's home. I knew there were people who came up to me and said, "Hi, Jean, how you doing?" And I didn't have a clue who they were, right? But I didn't want to believe that that kind of abuse took place. No, it didn't happen. But the physical evidence is there. Your dog's dead. So what are you going to do? You're going to get mad, aren't you? I want you to shoot that driver that killed your dog, right? But you can't do that. You get mad at the dog, right? How can you be so stupid just to run in the road and get killed? Get mad at yourself, right? Why did I have the dog on a leash? Why did I train him to stay out of the road? Why did I leave him at home? If I left him at home, he'd be well and alive, right? But he's dead. You get mad at God. How could you let this happen to my poor innocent animal, right? You get mad at the devil or evil or Satan in the world or whatever it is for bringing death. Even though you know death is part of the life cycle, you get mad. Oh my God, not now. Well, the same thing happened when I was a multiple. I got mad, and the anger went everywhere. I got mad at myself for being small and vulnerable and not telling. Even if I was tortured and punished not to tell anybody anything, I still got mad. Shirley would have stopped if I told her. I got mad at my perpetrator, but guess what? I couldn't shoot my father any more than you could shoot the guy who killed your dog, right? I had to deal with it differently. I got mad at God. How could you let this happen to an innocent child? I got mad at the devil. How could you how could you make this man as sick as to do those things to me? The anger went everywhere. But I had to deal with it, just as you have to deal with your anger. So what do you do with anger? If you don't take action, it feeds on you. Now, I didn't confront my father directly. I didn't want to give him an opportunity to say no. In the book, I wrote a little incident where my sister was doing her homework in the living room, or in the dining room, and my father walked in and kicked the cat. And she said, "You kicked the cat!" And he whipped around and said, "I did not kick the cat." And she's thinking, okay, the cat just threw himself sideways onto your shoe and then up on the wall 3 feet and ran out of the room screaming, "But you did not kick your cat. Now I think I'm going to be leaving, so I'm not the next one who doesn't get kicked." You see, he was so immediate with his denial that I knew that he would deny it. But I wasn't alone. So my 3 sisters and I confronted our mother. Unfortunately, my mother still lives with my father. Went home, didn't call. I finally called her and I said, well, did you confront him? And she said, well, I asked him if he was sexually abused as a child, and he said he wasn't either. I knew we lost my mother too. Well, my sister and I used to take those pumpkins that they leave out in the fields after Halloween and Thanksgiving, the little gnarly ones that nobody wants. We'd go down to Auburn, a little town south of us where they have miles and miles of pumpkin farms, and we'd buy those little ones they leave out in the fields. We'd take them out to her woods, draw faces on them, and throw them into the trees. You know, here's what I do with you, smash. It was a wonderful release. It was biodegradable, we didn't have to clean it up. In the book, I write a little story about throwing dishes. You know, we used to buy all these little clunky dishes, and we'd write nasty things on them that we'd never be able to verbalize, right? We'd spread a big paint tarp over a stump out in her woods, and we'd throw the dishes into the stump. What I didn't go far enough in the story, because we'd roll that tarp up, put it in a box, and carry it. She'd take one side, I'd take the other, and we'd haul it over to the dumpster. But we'd have to stop about every few feet, put the thing down. We'd be laughing so hard, because you see, my father likes to work jigsaw puzzles, so he kept saying, what if we just slap a label on it and mail it to him? He'd be wondering, going, what is this? You know? Well, we didn't do it, but it was a good therapy to think about doing it. So we did get past the anger. We did that lots of times because we went through lots of cycles. Okay, once we relieve the anger, though, what's next? Then we're going to go into grieving, right? Your dog's dead. You can't do anything about it. You can't shoot the driver of the car. You're going to grieve. You're going to grieve for the dog for the loss of his life. You're going to grieve for yourself for the loss of the dog's companionship. It's going to hurt. Well, the same thing happened to me when I was in multiple. I grieved over loss of my childhood. I wondered what I could have done with my life if I had been well and whole from the beginning. I looked back over my shoulder and I'd say, what decisions would I have made differently if I had not been crippled by dissociative disorder? Well, it doesn't work. After a while, you have to say, I've taken on enough, I've integrated, I'm not going to look over my shoulder the rest of my life, because when I'm looking back, what can't I do? You got to go forward. I can't go forward. If I want to be productive, I've got to say, this is where I am, I'm going to move forward. And eventually, you'll bury your dog. Okay, I'm going to give you one more joke, and then I'm going to read a little piece from my book, and then I'll open it for questions. There was a woman, I'm going to say a computing consultant, since that's what I did. How many people have a computer? Do you have a computer or work with a computer? Yeah. Well, you know when you have a computer, that as soon as you buy anything, software, hardware for it, before the door closes behind you, it's obsolete, right? You turn around and walk back in, they say, we don't sell that anymore. Here's the newest, latest, greatest. You know, being in the computing industry had a couple of advantages for me. For one thing, you didn't have to know it all, right? You could go in a meeting and they ask you, do you think Java will generate your GUI front end? And you go, I don't know. You pretend that you knew that they weren't talking about jelly donuts and coffee. And then you go out and look it up later and find out that Java is an environment like NT and DOS and OS2 and whatever. And GUI is not GUI like a donut, but GUI, the graphical user interface, that part of a computing system that comes up to you when you bring up an application. But, you know, you could make it better the next time after having looked it up. But also, I worked in security areas, and guess what? They wore name badges. An advantage when you don't know who it is talking to you. You say, oh, Bob, you know, I don't know your answer, but I'll look it up. Well, you know, I'm going to talk about a computing consultant. The computing consultant was reportedly at her office doing work for her client, when in reality she was out here on the golf course. You have a lot of nice golf courses. Anyway, she was out on the golf course, just on the 11th tee, just about to tee off when, bang, fell over dead, found herself before St. Peter. The pearly gates said, whoa, what happened? And St. Peter said, isn't your name Joanna White? And she said, yes, it is. And she said, well, Joanna, it's April 19th, 1998. You're right on time. I said, what? I can't be dead. She said, no, here you are, Joanna White, age 92. 92? I'm only 52. I'm supposed to live for another 40 years. He goes, no, we don't make those kinds of mistakes. Look right here. April 19th, 1998, Joanna White, age 9. Oh, I see where we made our mistake. We calculated your age based on your billable hours. Case for honesty. When I did Silencing the Voices, I wanted it to be as honest as I possibly could make it. I had it read by my husband, my doctors, my spouse, or my children, my pastor, all of my grown siblings, my grown children, anybody who was in here. In fact, my husband's sweetheart is, his best friend called me up and he said, "You're going to have to change this page about me." I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "I said Dawn was weird, not strange." Well, we were made for each other. Anyway, I sent this to be critiqued by a wonderful author in her own right, Peggy King Anderson. And she called me after she read it. She said, "I can't believe you're making yourself as vulnerable as you are by being as open and honest about your thoughts and feelings as you are in Silencing the Voices." I said, "Peggy, if people are going to understand not just what it is to live with MPD, but what it is to heal from it, then they need to know not just what was said and done, but what was thought and felt and never verbalized." And that's what I tried to put into Silencing the Voices. Now let me read one little paragraph for you. This is from the preface I wrote to Silencing the Voices. "There are some graphic scenes of abuse in the book. These are needed for the reader to understand the trauma behind in the fragments. However, this book is not about abuse, but about hope. In support survivor groups, I've heard the same question over and over: can I ever be well? The message I try to bring in person and in writing is to have faith. My conviction is that God brought me through that horrific time by giving me the ability for multiplicity. I believed in myself that I had the strength to overcome the fear and pain of childhood memories with God's help and with the support and guidance of my doctor, my family, and my friends. To heal, you must have faith. It's okay if you're mad at God. At least you know there is one. But if you don't believe in something greater than yourself, what base do you build upon when you're whirling out in space trying to pull your life together? You need to have faith. You know, it's difficult to find time to do everything we need to do in our lives, let alone the time to do the things we'd like to do. And I want to thank you all for sharing time with me today. Thank you so much. Okay, do we have questions? Yes.
Gina, I have a question which is to ask you, as you are now, with Jody and any other multiples that you have, are they totally integrated?
Yes, I am totally integrated. I am Jean and Jody and JD.
So not even for 5 minutes on February the 16th, are you in touch with them?
I am always in touch with all of them. Except, of course, when I dissociate watching a movie. Yes, but yes, I am well and whole. And I have met, in the last 8 years, approximately 150 people who have identified themselves as being multiple, and have talked with them, some of them for hours, about their process of getting well and whole, or where they are in their process. And I've been thinking about writing a follow-up little book on what I have discovered about it that I haven't seen anywhere, just from the fact that I have probably the most vast sampling of anybody I've heard of. But yeah, it's really amazing. Dr. Ryder writes a wonderful little analogy here in his foreword about integration. When I read it, I thought, boy, this is so true. The so-called fusion of the parts is one goal in therapy, allowing the person to feel more whole, intact, in control, and to live without the symptoms that occasion therapy in the first place. Before fusion, alters often question, do I have to be gone? I don't want to go away. I try to explain that a person is like an orchestra. When things are going well, the orchestra, that is the integrated individual, plays in a synchronized manner, and the sound, that is how the individual deals with life, is harmonious. We can still hear the individual instruments or parts, but they're well blended into the orchestral music. And that's truly how this works. Yes?
My somewhat random experience is that most people out there encounter with MPD or you have more than 3 personalities, and quite a few more.
Yeah, his question was, I think, why is it I only had 3 and many others have
And
many?
also, I imagine that would mean it's a little piece of maybe the trauma is less. I don't know how to manage it.
Well, let me give you a little bit of what I found and what I'm talking about, doing a follow-up on. I think that the older the child is when violent abuse commences, the more likely they are to have a fewer number of identities. I had a sort of loving, even though it was harmful, relationship with my father at 3.5. The people that I've met that have been under the age of 3 tend to have many, many more identities than I did. And really violent sexual abuse didn't begin until I was age 5.5. And in general, I haven't met anybody whose abuse did not begin before the age of 5. Most of them have been, but those that have before the age of 3, and many of them are from birth, tend to have many, many more identities. I have met a number of people who had 2 or 3 identities like I had. One of the fellows that I correspond with had 5, and we talked about the similarities of the ages in which abuse occurred. I also see 2 very distinctive structures in MPD, and I don't know, can I get a little clue? How many of you people are in some way in the mental or medical health other than a patient? Can you just kind of, quite a few. Well, I don't know what the background is, but I've seen 2 very distinctly different structures of MPD patients. Mine was a hierarchical structure. As Jean, I was unaware of anybody. Now, these aren't technical terms, they're just what I call them, okay? But I was a hierarchical structure. As Jean, I was unaware that there was anybody else. As Jody, I was aware that there was Jean, okay? But I didn't know there was anyone else. The wall was too thick over here. And as JD, the injured child, JD is the term that Jack Ryder and I came up with to call the little Jean, okay? It was just take the initials Jean Darby and make it Jean. But I was Jean. So if they talked about Jody, I knew there was a Jody. There was a big girl over here, Jody, okay? And there was me, and I was Jean. So if they talked about Jean, they were talking about me. So I was unaware that there was another beyond Jody. So that there was that hierarchical structure. And in recovery, I basically had to break that same hierarchical structure down. I had to resolve the differences between Jean and Jody, and then go and resolve the differences between Jean, Jody, and JB. And so it was a hierarchical structure. And the people that I've met who are well and whole, who have that kind of structure, went through pretty much the same process. They had to take the top 2 of the structure, the one that didn't know anything and the one that knew about that one, and resolve those differences and integrate basically the same kind of process in the same order that they separated. Now the other structure I've seen is what I call the group or troop structure, where you have a central host identity who's pretty numb emotionally because they've splintered off so many times that they don't really hold any emotion themselves. And if they're fortunate, they have a coordinator, and the coordinator not only knows about the host, but knows about everybody else, pulls in who they need when they need them. If they don't have a coordinator, those tend to be the people who are most non-functional, people who end up going back and forth to the hospital and spending long stays there. But the group or troop structure usually started from the beginning, before the age of 3, from birth on. Yes?
As part of getting well and whole, does one have to confront the abuser?
I didn't. I confronted him indirectly. I've met people who felt that they absolutely couldn't until they just were scream in their face and say, "You did this to me." I don't know that they have to. I think in many cases they can't. The abuser's dead, and so that's not a possibility. I don't think that's
necessarily a part of it.
I haven't. In fact, about half the people that I've met who are well and whole now said no, they didn't. They didn't want to. They didn't want, like I did. They didn't want to even get a chance to say, "No, I didn't do this to you," when you're well, I did. Yes.
I've read the book 3 Phases of Eve.
Yes.
She has 3 personalities and also Sybil. She's got about 22 personalities. When a person is not dead and big enough and large enough like Sybil, would it take how much more therapy, treatment, and medication a long period of time to recover?
I haven't found that to be true. And I'll tell you why. And I think, and again, this is just my theory in talking with people who've recovered. Very often when they've splintered off into many, many little identities, the differences in order to resolve those little pieces are pretty small. And once they go through a single incident of abuse, it may be only a single incident of abuse that has caused that little identity to splinter off, and then they can integrate that one in. So, I've met people who've made the trip in half the time that were the group of troop type than I have. So, I don't know. Yes, what Yes.
When you talk about becoming well and whole or recovering, whatever, do you believe that it's necessary to have integration, or are there other possibilities?
In the Word,
Could you
yes.
say something about that?
I talked to, I was out at Norwich University last week. It's Thursday, must be normal, 2 weeks ago. And I was talking to a counselor out there who said that she had a patient who was cooperative, that they knew all the identities and that they cooperated. But I've talked to people who were well and whole who were in that cooperative state, and what they said was it doesn't work. It doesn't work. No matter how much you talk over a decision in your life, the one who makes the decision and takes the action is the one in control of the time. Sorry, it just doesn't work. Now, all these systems work at some point because you became adult and you moved out. That's why I say, if I change the system, am I still going to be as functional as I've been? But cooperation just doesn't work. It doesn't. And when I talked to the counselor, I said, I have to ask myself, why are you still separated? Because I didn't have something that said, okay, now I'm going to sew these parts together. There wasn't a real process of putting these pieces together. It just happened as a consequence of resolving the differences. So I wondered, what material is she still in conflict with that's causing that separation to remain? Because once that's resolved, it just goes. You become one. So I think that integration, I've heard this debated back and forth, but I don't believe there's another goal. I think it's integration.
Once you were given your diagnosis, how long did your therapy go on for, and what were some of the things that were very helpful for you in that therapy?
I actually was in therapy from the time that I was diagnosed till I was well and whole for 10 years. Now, I've met a lot of people who made that trip much faster. I think part of the thing was, there were two different times when I ran away for months from Dr. Ryder, and I just said, I can't deal with this. And so he got a little better about it. He didn't use drugs in therapy, except for after he recognized that I was going to run away. If I got really over anxious, if I was dealing with a lot of pain, when I'm talking about grieving, probably the hardest grieving I went through was to say that the daddy who loved me and that monster in the basement was one and the same, and giving him up. That was real hard. And when I was going through that period of time, I just got really anxious. I could hardly work. And so he gave me, something to calm me down for a short period of time. And then there were short periods of time when I got extremely depressed about things. And then he would give me some medication to lift, Elavil or something like that, to help me out in that period of time. But as a whole, I haven't found any drugs that work. Sybil, by the way, was also schizophrenic. And Sybil, by the way, is well and whole today. Once they got her medication right, then they were able to work through therapy. Stuart Stern's the screenwriter for the movie Sybil, and he read Silencing the Voices, and he keeps in contact with Sybil, and she's doing okay. I used a lot of dream therapy in my process. Not so much that we discussed the dreams, but writing them down helped Jack Ryder to kind of track what was going on. And it's really gave him a biggest clue as to what was going on, because he kept saying, no, this doesn't make sense. These dreams don't have a continuum. And then when the first time he saw Jody, he just went right in, oh boy, now this makes sense, because these aren't the dreams of the same individual. So, I'm trying to think. Art therapy, JD did a lot of pictures, which then Jack presented to me to say, explain this to me. And then that would bring on a whole set of reactions and things like that. But mostly it was just talk therapy. Now, the other factor that took so long was that Jack was moving into forensic psychiatry a great deal. And for those who don't know, forensic means of or for the court. I told that to an editor one time that Jack was moving into forensic psychiatry, and she said, "What does a psychiatrist do with a dead person?" I went, "Oh, wait a minute, this woman's been watching too much Quincy." They used to start out, "I'm Quincy, the pathologist, forensic pathologist for the law." And for some reason, they've got that tied up. But law students study forensics, which is an art of court debate. Anyway, but Jack was moving into that, and consequently, he would get calls at all days, times of day and night, to go down to the court and evaluate somebody. And so he'd cancel appointment after appointment. And so it took me a long time. I mean, you don't see anybody for 3 months, then you don't make much progress. So yeah, I ended up working with another therapist. Did end up with a book, but yeah, to finish up my career. Does that answer you? Yes.
What's the difference then with schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia, and I'm not talking from a professional level, because I really don't know everything about it, but it has to do with a chemical imbalance in the brain that causes you to have mood swings and hear voices and things. When I talk about hearing voices, I talk to a number of MPD patients who've heard voices. It's either their alters talking or the screaming in reaction or whatever, like I had. But schizophrenics normally hear voices outside. When I was in junior high school, there was a girl who was a friend of mine, and she used to tell me that the telephone talked to her. I said, "Yeah, the telephone talks to me too. I pick it up. My mother says to get those dishes done before you get home." And she said, No, I don't have to pick it up. It just talks to me. And I'm going, ooh, But I met her about 20 years later, and she said, "Well, now the telephone doesn't talk to me anymore unless there's somebody at the other end. I take my medication now."
Sybil, she was schizophrenic.
Yeah, she was schizophrenic and multiple.
Is she still on drugs?
Yes, schizophrenia, once they get the drugs in balance, is my understanding, they take them for the rest of their life.
Yeah, you see, I've not been diagnosed, but I have been through a process over the last 10 years. And the information that's coming to me now, because I've done it totally without, 98% without the help of psychiatrists or psychologists, I've gone totally the holistic route, is schizophrenia. But prior to that, I was reading about multiple personality because I knew that something's off here and I need to heal this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was asking what the difference between that and schizophrenia. And I believe that drugs, you don't have to do it for this. That would be my.
Oh, okay, good. I'm waiting to see it because I apologize, but I am not.
Without drugs.
Well, great. Congratulations. I think it's great. Yes.
In the books, Sybil mentions that her mother was a schizophrenic. So would that be passed on through the genes?
I really don't know. I really don't. You hear the
There's an account of separate personalities that have certain illnesses, and another personality does not have the illness or certain symptoms. I was wondering what you think the implications of that are for somebody that is healthy.
Well, I don't know. I didn't have that problem with having different kinds of reactions, but I have met a number of MPD patients who say, "Well, I smoke, but she doesn't," or because I have a nicotine addiction and she doesn't. Another identity. I had one fellow who told me he was allergic to cats and dogs and horses and everything, and every time he got near one, he'd start sneezing, his eyes run, and everything else. Where he said none of my alters did have problems with it. So I don't know really. They're just making discoveries all the time about the physiological connections, and I really don't know. Yes.
In conflict techniques that Jack used, could you say what it was about him that made him a successful, maybe reluctant?
Well, one thing, Jack is very much a facilitator. He didn't really direct my therapy the way that I've heard a lot of people say, "Well, now we're going to work on this, or now we're going to work on that, or let's discuss this." He was more a facilitator. "Okay, tell me what's going on. What's going on with your life?" And then if I mentioned something, then he would say, "Well, can you tell me more about that?" Or "How do you feel about that?" Or he was very much a facilitator rather than a director of my therapy. I found that very rewarding. On the other hand, he wouldn't let me sit and say nothing. Come on, open them. The one thing I think it irritated me a lot at the time, but I found in retrospect it was very useful. He would not let me disown anything. So if I started to say, "Well, she did those bad things," it was like, "Beg your pardon?" Well, no, you're one person. You did this, okay? You might have been acting as an identity separate, but it's yours, and really forcing me to own all of my experience. And I found that very useful. In retrospect, at the time, I found it extremely irritating, but, it's not always the comfortable thing to do. Just a second. You had a question back here?
Yes, I did. Did you say that JD would do art and then he would show it to Jean? And
Yes.
ask Jean to explain JD's art?
Yes.
So how was that? I mean, did you know what the art was about?
Very often I did. I reacted. In fact, I have one scene in the book where I had drawn, as JD had drawn, the scene of the laundry room. And not that it was an excellent piece of art, but it was very recognizable. And I, as Jean, reacted violently to it. I mean, it was like, whoa, I don't want to see this, I don't want to hear it. I could hear the screaming going off in my head as soon as I saw that picture. So I knew exactly what it was. I didn't know all the connections at that time, and I didn't want to go through those feelings. And so I turned it down, and Jack looked it right back in my face and said, no, look at this, tell me what it is, because it was too important. Yes.
Is there something you can say or something you can do to try to make someone who's has multiple personalities realize it about themselves?
I can't really answer that because I'm not a professional. I get emails from all over the world, and the first thing that I do is tell them, I'm not a mental health professional. If you don't have a therapist, seek one out. I really don't believe that this is a self-help trip that you really need. I mean, we built some pretty strong walls up, and you need some guidance.
No, it's not what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, you're asking what I can say.
Someone else who knows someone who they
Yeah.
can reasonably believe.
Well, if I had a friend that I thought was a multiple, and I wanted to say, get some help, I would say, I might open up and tell them that I think they had a problem that they needed to talk to a therapist with. I mean, like my friend Peter, I said, this isn't normal. You need some help. Let's find somebody. I had one fellow that I met recently whose girlfriend, he was sure was a multiple, and he couldn't get her to go to a therapist. He said, I talked to her, and I said, I'll tell you what you do. If I were you, I'd tell her that I'm having a problem, and I want you to come with me and help me with my problem, and then get her to go along as help. It's not real truthful, but if you really love somebody and want them to get help, you bend. Anything else? Yes.
Perhaps a bit of a question, but how did your therapist help you when you were reliving the trauma or you were enmeshed in the feelings? I'm guessing that he was quite good about that, given what you said about him.
Yeah, it took a while for him to be able to really support me through it because he was so afraid that touching me in any way would cause a negative reaction. And in fact, the first time that he was successful in bringing JD out in his office, he actually brought his wife in, who was a therapist, and so he said, I wanted a woman sitting right next to you when this happened because I didn't want you to suddenly find yourself in a room with a huge man. He's 6'4", I mean, he's not. Yeah, he did that. After a while, he would get to the point of realizing that he could hold my hand through it, and it gave me a lot of support. But a lot of time, I got set off at night. We would go through material, and then I'd get set off at night. And fortunately, during that period of time, I was married to this wonderful man back here. And Stuart Stern, who read the book, read Silencing the Voices, called me up and he said, "This is absolutely riveting." And I just fell in love with your husband. So if you read the book. Also, in the back of the book, Don has written some questions. I really like this. Questions for Don Cline, the husband of an MPD patient. And they were so good. I sent them to the publisher thinking they'd use them for publicity, but they said, oh, no, this has to go in the book. And the first one was I nervous about marrying a multiple? And I thought, I didn't really ever think about that, but naturally it would be on your mind, I thought he'd be nervous about marrying me with 3 teenage daughters. Anyway, there's some good insight on that. But yeah, he had to work into what he could do, and to the point where he could give me a hug if I was in pain.
There's a lot of controversy about how much people need to re-experience original trauma in order to heal. What's your sense of that?
I think that you have to relive enough to realize that it really did happen to you, because we put up that wall saying, no, 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 no. And until we can say, yeah, this happened, and own that experience, I don't think you have to go through it forever and ever and ever. Enough is enough. But once you can own it, then you can throw it all back. You know, there's nothing makes me madder than when I'm in therapy and somebody say, why don't you forget it, put it behind you and get on with your life. I go, well, wait a minute, I've been doing that all along. I put up that wall and I've been moving on and on and on. I can't put it behind me till I see it in front of me and deal with it. But at some point I've dealt with enough of it that I can move on. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I just want to make a comment to that. In my particular case, I found that what's important is just to feel the feelings, not necessarily get into analyzing, but just allow the feelings and
Absolutely.
to allow them just to be and they just
Yeah, that is the most important thing. It's not every individual incident of abuse, but it's that whole feeling that I was helpless and injured and going on with it. Anyway, yes.
How did you know when the integration was complete?
When I suddenly realized that I was driving a car, I suddenly realized that I was JD, because it shouldn't seem outstanding to me that I would be driving a car. I've been driving all my life. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm here. Okay, so I knew at that point. Now I will tell you a little story. I hadn't intended to get into this, and we're getting late, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. Silencing the Voices ends one step before the end. That book is 416 pages long. So, you know, what do you put in and what do you put out? You know, you don't want to end up writing forever, and nobody wants to read forever. But after I had integrated Jean and Jody and JD, it was probably, I don't know, 4 months, 5 months after that, I started getting a headache right down a line in my eye. And, you know, I thought, oh, there's something wrong with my eye, and I went to the eye doctor, and there's something wrong with my glasses. And, you know, that was back to, well, what's going on? Well, there was a placeholder, a little bit of memory that held an abusive scene from when I was 2.5. Nobody remembers anything from the 2.5, you know, all I thought was this pain. But, you know, eventually we were able, mostly through self-hypnosis, you know, concentrating on that pain. I didn't undergo hypnosis, but, you know, I was taught to later concentrate on it. But to find out what that memory was. Now, the reason it's so interesting to me is that it is the only memory of being 2.5 that I can remember. I mean, who remembers anything from 2.5? But because it was an abusive scene, everything in that moment was encapsulated. It's really an amazing piece of memory. I was 2.5, and I know I was 2.5 because my brother was 4. It was his 4th birthday. It was right after World War II, and the toy manufacturers had just reissued metal and rubber to the, you know, had just been reissued metal and rubber. And so here we had a Tonka truck that he got for his birthday. It had rubber wheels with wooden floors in this little 2-story duplex we lived in. And, you know, oh man, this thing rolls on the floor without making noise. And my brother and I got into a fight over it. And my father all of a sudden grabbed Matt up and started smacking him. And of course I started immediately saying, don't hit Matt, you know, because, you know, I knew that was my fault. I was playing with his truck. And, but at that point, my father just smacked me to the floor, and I looked up the staircase. Now, I don't know what the trajectory is of a straight staircase up one story, maybe 16, 18 feet up. But to me, that staircase is 100 feet high with stairs 3 feet high. I mean, that's what it looks like when you're 2.5 years old, lying on the floor. But, you know, so I don't ever want to see that duplex for reality, because it's my own little mental, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids view of the world. But in any case, he said, your mother's not here. He took Freddie Shoemaker and Tony Buckleballer home from the party, so I knew there was a party. And I also had these very strange long names, right? So at that point, of course, I jumped up and I grabbed my father's arm to try to get him to stop hitting Matt. And he kind of swung his arm out, and I whirled around and I hit right on the corner of the door jamb, bang, right across the center of my face. And ergo, I had this pain, this line of pain from hitting the door and getting knocked unconscious. Well, what's interesting about it is that that it was the one thing from my childhood that I could really verify without anybody really understanding that that's what I was doing. I invited my mother up to get hanging fuchsia for her porch for her birthday in May last year. And I wanted to get some bushes for my garden. And so I said, let's go out in the back here. And, we wandered way out in the nursery to get some bushes. And while we're walking out there, just walking along, I said, by the way, I wonder whatever happened to Freddie Shoemaker and Tony Bickabowler. And she turned around and she looked at me. She said, how can you possibly remember those names? You weren't even 3 years old when we moved from that city, and we haven't seen or heard from them since. And I went, yes! Because it verified that little memory of being 2.5. Otherwise, there's no way I would know. No way. So another little success for me. Anyway, it's getting late, and I need to wrap up. But I want to thank you again for coming and for all your insightful questions and your interest and your patience and putting up with my corny jokes. Thank you.